introduce Austin to the rest of the crowd here. Austin Gadient from Vali Cyber, their CTO and co-founder, is going to present their solutions for hypervisor security for us. I've seen a couple of his presentations before, so this should be good.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Christian. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much for having Vali Cyber here at the VMUG Norway event. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can all of you see the slide that I'm sharing?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to be talking about hypervisor security and how modern threat actors typically go after VMware environments, and a new solution that Vali Cyber has created to address these issues with hypervisor security. I'm a CTO and co-founder of Vali Cyber. Like Christian was saying, I'm a security V expert as well. And I started my security journey in the US Air Force. I was responsible for security for satellites, satellites in orbit, satellite ground systems, and a lot of those run Linux systems. So Vali Cyber started as a Linux security company, and as we grew, we entered this very interesting area of the market, which is hypervisor security, and in particular ESX security. And there's a lot of good reasons why you want additional security on your VMware systems, and we'll talk about that throughout this presentation. So starting off, I'll just highlight what happened in 2025. There were a lot of attacks early in the year by a group called Scattered Spider. And Scattered Spider is really an initial access threat actor. What they'll do is they'll gain access to environments, and then they'll team with ransomware actors to launch ransomware against VMware environments. And the reason why hypervisors get targeted for ransomware so much is because if an attacker breaks into the hypervisor, they can encrypt the virtual hard disks. And that's a bad day. If your virtual hard disk gets encrypted, you can't really run your VMs. Your whole private cloud can go down all at once. And so organizations are very motivated to pay ransoms, and these attacks tend to be very lucrative for threat actors that are able to pull them off. The other thing that I would mention is that ransomware is not the only sort of threat that affects hypervisors. There was another campaign that was discussed late last year, sort of in December of 2025. This was called the Brickstorm campaign. And so Brickstorm was a series of attacks against VMware infrastructure that were more persistence focused. So the goal of the attacker was to get access to the hypervisor, dwell there for a long time, and steal data from the hypervisor layer. So they'll pull data from the virtual hard disks, they'll export the virtual hard disks, and then try to analyze those offsite to steal secrets, code secrets, or tokens, authentication information, that sort of thing. And VMware is the one that gets targeted the most out of the hypervisor vendors that are out there, at least publicly, relating to public disclosures. But I think that's because VMware's the most widely deployed hypervisor. That said, there are other hypervisors that are becoming more popular, and those are also starting to be targeted. So there was some research that was also released late last year in December of 2025 about the first public example of the Nutanix ransomware attack. And so we're not going to be talking about Nutanix ransomware so much in this presentation, but I think it's worth noting that other hypervisors have these sorts of problems and suffer from these attacks as well. Now, in 2025, there was also another key development, which was ESXi getting added to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is essentially a group of tactics and techniques and procedures that threat actors will execute across different stages of their attacks. So it'll go all the way from reconnaissance all the way to downloading and running malware and encrypting files on your system. And ESX was added as a new platform on the same level as Windows or Linux or Mac OS. And it was added as a new platform because of the prevalence of attacks against the system. There were specific TTPs added for ESX. I would also mention that MITRE themselves were breached in their VMware environment. If you're not familiar with MITRE, they're a pretty large defense contractor in the US, and they do a lot in the world of cybersecurity. So they run the CVE database, for example. MITRE does that. They obviously run the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And so the fact that they got breached in their VMware environment, I think, shows that even folks that are very knowledgeable and expert in security can certainly experience these attacks as well. It doesn't just happen to novice users. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Scattered Spider. So Scattered Spider has been around really since 2022, and as I mentioned before, they're focused on getting initial access and gaining initial access to systems. The attacks that they executed over the next few years typically targeted organizations in the UK and in the United States. And the way they perpetrate their attacks are by working with other ransomware actors. So the interesting thing about these threat actors is they sort of organize themselves like companies. So they'll specialize in different areas. Scattered Spider specializes in initial access. So they will try to get access to environments and then they'll work with a ransomware organization to actually go through with launching the ransomware and then handling the negotiation for whatever payment they want from that extortion attempt. And the way Scattered Spider gets access to environments is going to be through typically they're going to launch a social engineering campaign against the help desk. And so they'll go for third-party help desks. They'll use fake cell phone numbers using SIM swapping attacks. They'll also use AI-generated voice content to sort of call into a help desk and say, hey, I'm a security administrator or I'm an IT admin. I've forgotten my password. Help me reset it. And that this is how they typically get initial credentials. And if you think about these help desks, they're dealing with thousands of issues a day. And so after enough attempts, these threat actors can be very successful in getting at least some initial access credentials. Then from there, they'll move around the cloud environment and eventually find their way into the VMware environment itself. So let's take a look at what this attack actually looks like. So we're going to assume that we're a threat actor and we have access to vCenter. We've stolen the password for vCenter. What can an attacker do from here? So we're going to show a video of logging in to the vCenter instance. And we have a hypervisor here that has two virtual machines on it. There's an Ubuntu virtual machine as well as a VM called Walter White. And what they're going to do is just turn on SSH. So they're going to turn on the SSH shell. And a lot of people have SSH disabled by default, which is a good practice. The problem is if the attacker has credentials to vCenter, they can just turn it back on very easily. And the attacker is going to try to encrypt this Walter White VM. So they're going to try to launch the ransomware attack and encrypt this VM. So using these stolen credentials, they're going to log into the host. And as they log in, they're going to head over to the VMFS or the virtual file system for this VM. And they're going to try to encrypt it. So we'll head over to the Walter White VM. We'll try to encrypt it. And before we actually finish running this command, I want to talk through it a little bit because the command is a little bit complicated. So this is an example of, sorry, I jumped ahead here. So let's get back to where we were on the video. So this is an example of a living off the land attack. A living off the land attack is one where the attacker uses tools that are already on the hypervisor to attack the hypervisor. And so what they're going to use is grep to list out the files they want to encrypt. They want to use OpenSSL to do the actual file encryption. Then they'll use RM to do the deletion. The key thing here is they're not actually downloading ransomware onto the ESX host to do the encryption. They're using these tools that are natively installed on ESX that are signed by Broadcom. They pass all the exec installed only protections and they're able to run and encrypt files. And so if we run this series of commands, what's going to end up happening that we'll see is that this VM is going to be encrypted. It takes a couple seconds and we can see that these VMDK files, VMX files, they have this little nuclear extension appended to them. Those are the encrypted files. And so if we try to run this VM, we're going to have an issue. Try to power it on, doesn't work. We get this nasty error. This is a bad day if you're the administrator for this system. Now, it's worth noting that in this demo, we sort of did things through the GUI to help make it easy to understand what was going on. But in practice, what attackers will do is they'll just script all of this. So they'll script all of it using PowerCLI. They will log into vCenter using PowerCLI. They'll turn on SSH on all of the ESX systems using PowerCLI. And then from there, they will script the logins and the actual running of the ransomware. So these attacks end up happening within the matter of a few minutes. They're very quick once the attacker gets to this level. Now, another attack that we talked about is the Brickstorm campaign. So we'll dive into this one a little bit more. So Brickstorm was this campaign that really started with compromised F5 networks, big IP network appliances. These were firewalls that were in the networks of the victim organizations. There was a supply chain attack against those firewalls, which then allowed the threat actor to get access to the vCenter environment, the VMware environment. From there, they would do things like use exploits or steal credentials to actually gain access to vCenter and the ESX systems. And they would deploy these malware samples, these Brickstorm malware samples. And the goal of those malware samples was to set up these encrypted channels that were very hard for a defender to notice. They would set up these encrypted network connections that would allow the attacker to steal the VMDKs out of the environment. And so let's see what this looks like in practice. So here we've got a demo. We're going to go through and we're going to go after a guest virtual machine. So we'll log into a guest VM. We see that there's a file called demo note that's got super secret password. This is some data that the attacker wants to try and read inside of a guest virtual machine. And so now what the attacker is going to do is log into the ESX host, and they're going to make a clone of the virtual hard disks. And this is what was done by these threat actors. They've listed out the virtual machine. We can see this virtual machine is the one that we want to clone. And then they'll use this vmk fstools command to clone the virtual machine hard disk. And all of this is happening while the VM is running. Since this is why the attack is so stealthy, no one really notices this file is being made under the hood because they're not paying attention to what's happening on the command line. Everything from the vCenter GUI looks normal. The VM is running. Nothing is particularly strange at this point. And what the attackers would then do is they would extract the VMDK files using a statically compiled 7-zip executable. So we'll go ahead and do that now. This will give us two different .img files, which provide the hard disk information that was in this virtual hard disk. And from here, they will try to read some of that data. And so we'll do something, at least to start, that's pretty simple. We'll just use a sed command to try and search for that super secret password string in one of the .img files. When you do that, that works just fine. We'll see that after a few seconds of searching, the password pops out. So we're able to read data out of these .img files that might be sensitive. And the attacker can take things a step further. If they export the VMDK into their own environment, now they can actually do a more sophisticated forensics analysis on it. And what we'll do is we will open up this mount.sh script, and I'll pause here to sort of talk through what we're doing. So we're going to set up a device that allows us to mount the VMDK. So we'll mount the VMDK as a device on the system, and then after that, essentially, we'll get access to the root file system for this VM. So we'll be able to traverse through the root file system just like we were SSH in the VM itself. This will give us direct access to the files inside of that VM. And so we'll make some directories and actually mount it in this device that we've set up for the virtual machine image. So we'll go ahead and run that script. And it takes a couple seconds. We'll head over to the mount that we created, and we can see that there is this demo note file. And so there we go. There's the super secret password. So this is how an attacker can sort of steal data out of an environment. They'll run malware on the hypervisor. They'll send the VMDK data out of the hypervisor environment using that encrypted network connection. And then they will mount it in their own environment, and they'll try to read the data out of the VMDK. And what the attackers were typically going after were things like company secrets, maybe source code. They're also going to target things like an Active Directory server that will have credentials for other systems in the environment. So this is a very common target for threat actors that are going after these VMware environments. Okay, so we talked through two big attacks. I think another one is FireAnt. So FireAnt was another threat actor that was pretty busy last year, and they were executing these Brickstorm style attacks that were trying to steal data out of environments. And a technique that they used was to deploy malicious VIBs or vSphere installation bundles. And so a VIB is how you install software on an ESX host. And normally it's protected by something called acceptance levels. So there are acceptance levels on ESX that define what level of VIB can be installed. If it's a community VIB, that means it has not been signed by Broadcom. And so by default, ESX does not allow you to install community VIBs. But if you're able to find a way to perhaps install a community VIB or tamper with the acceptance level, maybe you can go ahead and run one of these VIBs and then run some unsigned code on the hypervisor. The other key protection is exec installed only, which we'll talk about here in this next video. So what the attacker has done here is they've logged into or they're going to log into a hypervisor. They're going to try to run an Akira ransomware sample. And on the right screen, what we're doing is we're tailing the VM kernel log. So we'll log in here, we'll try to run the ransomware. Then on the right, we get this error about sh exec denied, this file, this long malware file name, which is just a hash, is not installed. And so this is the exec installed only protection. What exec installed only does is it says, I'm only going to let you run code that has been installed on the ESX host. So it has to be installed through a vid. If you try to just copy something onto the host, I'm not going to let it run. Now, what is a vib? A vib is really just a tar gzip file that has an XML data structure. So that XML data essentially defines how the files are laid out within the vib itself. And then that defines where the files get placed once the vib is installed. So if we sort of pull things apart, we can try to create our own vib. We can create our own community supported vib and try to install it on the host. And if it's a community supported vib, it's not going to be signed by Broadcom. So let's see what happens when we try to install a community vib that includes our ransomware on this host. So we'll copy the vib onto the host, we'll SSH in, and we will try to install that vib right now. And so we can see it failed some checks. So what we can also try to do is just force the install. We'll give it a -f parameter to try and force it to be installed. And we're going to see this error about the software acceptance level. So the software acceptance level for this vib is community. And the system has an acceptance level set to partner. So essentially, it will only allow you to install a vib if it has been signed by Broadcom. And as an attacker, we don't have access to the private key for Broadcom. We can't sign our code with it. If we just try to naively set the acceptance level to be community supported, that doesn't work either because the person that's running this ESX system has secure boot turned on. So if you have secure boot turned on, you're not supposed to be able to tamper with the acceptance level, which then means you're not able to install a community supported vib. But what if we could tamper with that acceptance level? And I think the way to figure that out is you can read the code. So ESX CLI is a Python script, and that Python script is just plain text code that's available on the ESX system that you can read. And there are a couple interesting methods in the Python. One of them is get host acceptance. Another one is set host acceptance. And underneath the hood, they run this function called run command advanced configuration, setting the acceptance level or reading the acceptance level. And the interesting thing is that there's a check inside of the Python code that says, hey, if secure boot is turned on, don't run this code. We're not going to allow you to set the acceptance level to be community supported if we have the secure boot setting turned on. But that check is in the Python code. So what if we can just bypass that check and just call the code directly by some other method? And so what the attacker is going to do here is, again, we'll see that the acceptance level is partner supported. The attacker is going to run a series of commands. And I'll talk through what these commands do. So first, what they do is they modify what's called the config store. And so the config store is the runtime configuration of the ESX host. And what we'll do is we'll basically modify that. It's a JSON structure. So we'll put this acceptance level information into this JSON file. Then we'll use the config store CLI application to set the acceptance level to be this acceptance level. And now if we run that Python command again, that ESX CLI command again, we'll see that when we try to read the acceptance level, it has now been set to community. So basically the attacker has bypassed that check that exists in the ESX CLI. And what they can do now is they can install their vib. And we'll see that this time the vib installation is successful. And now we can go ahead and run that ransomware sample. And so the ransomware runs now. It doesn't get blocked by exec installed only because it's been installed through a vib. Now, this issue has been disclosed to Broadcom. They're still working on fixing it. I don't think it's been fixed in 9.1 as far as I know. We tested it with the latest 9.1 image that we had. There's also another security researcher that you all may be familiar with. His name is Anders Olsen. He is in Sweden. And Anders took this research and expanded on it a little bit. And he was able to find that you can install these community VIBs through this method, and you can reboot the system, and the VIB will still be there. And so there's no purple screen that shows up about a secure boot error. The VIB will still be there. This allows the attacker to gain persistence on the host, even if secure boot is turned on, even if you have exec installed only turned on. So it effectively makes those protections not very useful for an attacker that is able to use this method. And this method is available on every version of ESX that I know of today. So it's definitely a problem. It's something that is being worked on to be fixed by Broadcom. It was disclosed to them back in January of this year. So we have all these issues with ESX attacks. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been some attacks against Nutanix as well. So Nutanix AHV had a publicly listed attack in November of last year by the Akira ransomware group. And so that's the same group that ran that or created that ransomware sample we showed in that earlier demo. I'll also say that the way that we've been defending VMware environments historically is to use a lot of perimeter-based defense. So we're going to set up network perimeters, we're going to set up firewalls, and maybe use some identity security tools to sort of block access to the hypervisor. The problem is that if the attacker gets access to the hypervisor, they can do a lot of bad things, like we showed in these previous demos. And there are some protections native on the hypervisor, but there are ways to get around it. I think another way to get around exec installed only is to just use scripts. So instead of trying to run an executable, you could use a Python script or a shell script like we saw with those living off the land OpenSSL attacks. And there's been a lot of other researchers that have been talking about this. So Google Mandiant last year made a prediction that in 2026, there will be a lot of hypervisor sort of infrastructure level attacks. And one of the big problems is that there's a lack of detection and response visibility on the ESX hypervisor. So it's really hard to see what is going on those systems because there's a lack of tooling. You can use syslog perhaps, and you can try to read data from syslog on the ESX host. The problem is there's a lot of data that gets generated by that approach, and it doesn't really, if you have a large environment, I think it can be difficult for a SIEM to ingest all of that data. There's also been a trend to focus more on preemptive security, and I think this has been driven by a lot of the AI-related security events that we've seen. So Mythos has been a big security event, Mythos finding a lot of CVEs in systems. And the preemptive security idea is that we want to try to block attacks before they do damage. We want to try to block exploits. Even if there's a CVE, let's try to block the exploit rather than focusing on this patch cycle. And so we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But these problems and these other issues that have been identified by these third-party vendors are why we created ZeroLock. So ZeroLock is our solution for addressing security issues on ESX. And it's built on three main pillars. So the pillars are perform, preempt, and protect. So we'll start by talking about perform. And this slide is what we call the onion slide. It shows us the different layers of security that ZeroLock provides on the ESX host. We'll talk through each of these with a demo. So let's start by performance. First, we are approved by Broadcom. This is very important. We have to be certified by Broadcom for Broadcom to allow you to run this in an environment that is supported by Broadcom. And we do this through a certification process that has our VIB signed. So it's not a community VIB. It is a VIB that is signed at the VMware accepted level. We are certified on VMware ESX 7 all the way up through 9.1. This QR code will take you to a website which shows you our certification listings. If you want to go view it, that's a Broadcom website that it will take you to. Now, one of the key things that's nice about having this VIB is it allows a very streamlined deployment. So essentially, we can deploy in vCenter environments by uploading the VIB into vCenter, and then you deploy the VIB out from vCenter like a normal ESX update. So the deployment process for this VIB is just like deploying any other VIB that you might get from Broadcom or from some other third-party vendor. It's a very normal update process for an ESX admin. It's also worth noting that this certification process requires us to run our solution in a resource sandbox. So we can only use so much memory and so much RAM. We use on average about 50 megabytes of RAM and less than 5% of one CPU core. So there's not a lot of performance impact from the solution. You shouldn't notice any sort of performance impact on your workloads. And the way you start out a deployment is with the management console. The management console is an OVA. It's a virtual machine appliance that you deploy in your VMware environment. And then from there, you install the agents themselves. And so you install those through vCenter. We also recognize that we need to fit into your broader security infrastructure. So we will forward any data or alerts that are generated by the solution to your SIEM or SOAR solution of choice. We have integrations with Splunk and Google SecOps and Cribble, lots of other popular SOARs and SIEMs as well. It's also worth noting that this solution doesn't require any sort of network connectivity. So it can be totally air-gapped if your VMware environment is segmented off from the greater internet or from the greater cloud network. That's not a problem. The solution works entirely air-gapped. All the detection and protection logic is located on the management console and on the agent itself. Okay, so let's talk about preempt. So preempt is where we stop attacks before they do damage. And we saw a lot of different examples of attacks early in the presentation. So the first protection we're going to provide is multi-factor authentication for the command line, or CLI MFA. So this is the management console for ZeroLock. We can see different alerts across different categories here at the top. We also see a list of endpoints that are under protection. So in this demo, we're going to be going after these ESXi 8, ESXi 9 systems. This is what the attacker will be focusing on. There are 3 virtual machines, Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli. This is what the attacker will try to encrypt in their attempts. And we're going to SSH in. We're going to assume the attacker has stolen the password. And now we'll put in the MFA authentication. So this is something that's provided by ZeroLock, is just MFA for the command line itself. The MFA is done using a time-based token. So you'll scan a QR code in the ZeroLock management console. You will then get access to a time-based token that rotates every 30 seconds, just like any sort of cell phone-based authenticator app that you might be familiar with. Now, it's worth noting that when you do this SSH login, all of the MFA information is located on the agent. So if you're in a situation where your network isn't reliable, maybe because you've experienced a cyber attack, you can still log into your hosts. You can still MFA into your hosts. This MFA implementation doesn't require the agent to make outbound network connections to external identity providers. All the identity information is located on the agent itself. Right, so the next layer is the application allow listing. Application allow listing is our ability to identify when applications are allowed or not allowed to be run on a host. And we do this by taking an inventory of all the applications on the ESX host. And if we see something new get added, we'll block it by default. It's sort of like exec installed only, although it extends to scripts as well. So it's executables and scripts too. And so what the attacker is going to do in this example is they'll wget down a Brickstorm ransomware sample. This was one of the same samples used in the Brickstorm campaign. They'll chmod it to make it executable. And when they run it, they get kicked off the host. We have a new alert in the ZeroLock management console about a malicious executable. We can see a list of files that were impacted by the attack. So the Brickstorm file was created. It was then modified by the chmod command. We also get a process tree. So the process tree shows us the history of the attack, sort of where it came from. It came from SSH. We also get information like executable hashes and full command line arguments. So this is great threat intelligence information. If you are trying to understand why ZeroLock responded to an alert or what might be happening on your hypervisor that would cause an alert, this information can be very useful when you're responding to an attack. Now, the next layer that we'll talk about is anti-tampering. Anti-tampering and the next layer beyond it, exploit prevention, they're all enabled by something called lockdown rules. So lockdown rules are these fine-grained access control rules that allow us to define files that we want or don't want to allow access to, network resources that we want to allow or block access to, and then programs that we should allow or not allow to run on the host. And we can use these rules to do a lot of very cool things. One of them is anti-tampering. So ZeroLock is a security agent. And because of that, an attacker that's going after your hypervisor, one of the first things that they'll want to do is try to turn off the security that's available. So they'll try to turn off ZeroLock. So ZeroLock has anti-tampering to prevent that from happening. So we'll go ahead and take a look at one of these rules. There's a rule about manipulation of the ZeroLock service through hostd. And this rule basically works on regex. That's what all these rules are based on. So they'll look for attempts by host D to try and start or stop or restart the ZeroLock process. And so the attacker is going to use a PowerShell script or PowerCLI script to try and remove the ZeroLock component. When they do that, the command fails. We get a new alert in the console. This is generated by that rule protecting the ZeroLock service. And if we go into the details, we can see no files were affected for this attack, but we do have some examples of the command line information, IP address information, and we can see the actual command that was alerted on. It was this attempt to remove the ZeroLock component from the host. Now, you might be wondering, well, this is good, but what if I actually need to install ZeroLock from the host, or what if there's some good reason for me to be doing a PowerCLI operation that turns off the agent? And we have a couple answers for that. One of them is if you do need to disable the agent, the way to do it is through the ZeroLock management console. So you can turn it off this way. There's also an alert only mode. So the alert only mode essentially says during a certain time period with a mandatory timeout, if you have an alert that happens on the system, we're just going to alert about it. We're not going to block any of the behavior. We're not going to stop anything. We're just going to send an alert. And there is a mandatory timeout for this capability, which means that if someone forgets to turn it back to a protective state and it's still in that alert only mode state, it will automatically transition back after that timeout happens. The default is 24 hours, but you can set it for whatever you want. This is very helpful if you're doing maintenance on a host or you have to set up a maintenance window and run a bunch of commands. You want to still know what's going on, but you don't want to be blocked necessarily. Okay, another key capability that is enabled by ZeroLock is exploit prevention and virtual patching. So there were some CVEs that came out last year in the Pwn to Own Berlin competition. There was actually a new one that was released this year, just a couple weeks ago, for VMware ESX, and these were escape to host vulnerabilities. So these were basically attacks that started in a virtual machine, in a guest virtual machine, and the goal of the attacker was to escape into the host hypervisor. So we're going to see how ZeroLock can stop this sort of attack. And we're going to do this again with a lockdown rule. And this time the rule is going to be a little bit different. So this rule looks at the VMX process as the source. It just prevents VMX from running shells or wget or netcat or any of these other commands that might be malicious. And VMX is the application that runs VMs. So the attacker is going to try to run an exploit script that runs the exploit that was used to Pwn to Own last year. And the script says it was successful, but if we go back to the alerts, we can see that there was a new alert about this attempt that was actually a failure for the attacker. The attacker's processes were killed, no files were affected, and this time the attack goes through the VMX application. So the VMX is the application that ran the VM, and then we have what VMX tried to do. They tried to run a reverse netcat session out of the VMX process. They basically tried to use the VMX process to connect back to the attacker infrastructure. And this is something that VMX should never do. Now, something that's really nice about the virtual patching capability is you don't have to reboot your host for it. So if there's a new CVE that comes out, we need to apply a new rule for it. You just apply the rule, gets added to the agent. You don't have to do a reboot. So that's nice for deploying this at scale across a large infrastructure. The other benefit of this capability is it's more future-proof than traditional patching. So if you think about patching, you have a CVE that comes out, you have a patch. You have another CVE that comes out, you have another patch. With this virtual patching or exploit prevention, what we're really doing is looking at exploit behavior. So what behavior happens when an exploit of the VMX process happens? And just like there were exploits that targeted VMX last year, exploits are targeting VMX this year. There will be more exploits that target VMX in the future. All those CVEs that come out all execute similar behavior when you're looking at the exploit behavior itself. And so you apply this rule that protects VMX, you actually get coverage for not only past vulnerabilities, but future vulnerabilities that might affect the VMX application. So it's a really great way to have a mitigating control for a CVE or a vulnerability without having to run around like your hair's on fire every time a new critical CVE gets logged by a vendor. Okay. So the last layer that we'll talk about is the protection. So this is AI detection and automated remediation. And this assumes that the attacker has bypassed all these other layers of control. We have turned off all those other layers for this demo. and we're going to see a detection engine that looks for a specific type of malware. So in this case, we're going to be looking for ransomware itself. And we're going to use that same command that we used earlier. We're going to use this living off the land attack that uses grep and OpenSSL and RM to do the encryption. And we're going to do it against an ESXi 9 host in this example. So we're going to try to encrypt the Gandalf VM. When we do that, we get kicked off the host. That was ZeroLock in action. ZeroLock was basically looking for the file encryption behavior. But because we're looking for file encryption, some files have to be encrypted before we actually do the detection. So we noticed that the VMDK file was impacted. And if we go ahead and expand and look at all the processes, we see the OpenSSL command that was run. We can see the RM command that was run as well. And if we try to run the VM, we get a nasty red error. Basically says the VMDK file was not found. This is a bad day, except ZeroLock has the easy button. So ZeroLock has this remediate button that allows us to undo damage to the file system. So we're going to restore the VMDK file, and now we can power on the VM and it runs just fine. So ZeroLock is not a backup solution. You shouldn't think of it as a backup solution like Veeam. What it does have is this remediation capability that it allows it to quickly clean up from an attack. It might remove an exploit script from your system. It might remove malware from your system. It can also restore files that were damaged by an attack. And it does this using a cache store of data that we have on a separate data store for the host. Okay, and this is a little bonus demo. This is based on something that Christian likes to show in some of his previous presentations. He's done a lot of presentations on rogue VMs, and so I'll just give an example of how ZeroLock can block an attempt to run a rogue VM. A rogue VM is one where you run the virtual machine from the command line, and you don't actually see it in the ESX console or in the vCenter web console. So it's a rogue VM because it's running on your ESX host, but you don't really see it in the GUI. And this provides a persistence and sort of a stealthy way for an attacker to have a VM in the environment. And so if an attacker tries to run this command on the host, they get kicked out and we get a program execution attempt. Again, this was a lockdown rule. So this was a lockdown rule that looked for that attempt to run VMX-X from the command line. If you try to do that with ZeroLock installed, it's going to get blocked. These rogue VMs get blocked by ZeroLock. Okay. So we have a couple resources you can take a look at. First one is sort of a guide for preemptive hypervisor security that might be useful for a CISO. The next one is a guide that talks about the Brickstorm campaign and what ZeroLock can do about the Brickstorm campaign. Then lastly, there's an exclusive offer for VMUG members to get a free license of ZeroLock. So if you want to try it out in your lab or you want to test it out, you can definitely get that free license and apply for it, and we can provide it to you so you can try out the solution yourself. So I believe that is all for the presentation. I'll leave the QR codes up there so people can scan them as they see fit. What questions do people have?
Don't think there are any questions from Bergen at least, but that partner level, acceptance level thing is kind of funny.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting.
It's given that ESX CLI is just a Python script, I wonder what other things are in there that you can manipulate as well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth some research. I mean, there's a lot of code in there that you can read, and now you can use Claude Code to go analyze all that code and see if there's some interesting attack surfaces that you want to take a look at. So you can do that in a very automated fashion. You don't have to manually look through all that code today.
Yeah, that reminds me, I have a session with Anders later on.
There you go. Yeah, you can talk about it with him.
So there's more to come, basically.
Absolutely.
I don't know if anyone else has any questions.
Okay, it sounds like we're all good. So if anyone does have questions that they want to ask, or if you want to follow up, you can reach out to us at info@valleycyber.com. But with that, we really appreciate your attention today for this presentation, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Austin.